Welcome to Chapter 4. These are the notes on cell theory, the first section. The standards associated with this is that you can trace the historical development of the cell theory, and while this PowerPoint doesn't go over the historical development of the cell theory, it does address the second one, which is to explain the three components of the cell theory. You'll be doing the historical development part in a short research project to create a timeline. So just as a reminder, when we call something a theory, it's the best explanation that has been supported by many observations or many trials and tests. The cell theory is pretty dynamic, actually, and currently it has three main parts. All living things are composed of one or more cells. Cells are the basic unit of structure and function, and that cells come from the reproduction of existing cells. We're going to go through and talk about the three of these in depth, but before we do, I want to go back to this theory this idea that it is a cell theory, and it's supported by many observations, but as technology advances and our observations become more and more detailed, and we are able to manipulate more and more things about cells, some of this may actually change. And I'll talk about that as we get to each one of these parts, or in one part in particular. So the first part of the cell theory is that all living things are composed of at least one or more cells. You're pretty familiar with the terms unicellular, multicellular. There are also these little things called unicellular colonies. So to the left here, these pictures, these are all of different types of bacteria, which are single-celled organisms. There are also single-celled organisms that are not bacteria. They're called protists. And these protists don't even fall within the realm of bacteria. In fact, these protists are either classified as animal-like protists or plant-like protists, but they are more like animal cells and plant cells than they are like bacteria. We'll learn more about those a little later. But these unicellular colonies are pretty cool. In this case, you have several single-celled organisms that actually group together to form colonies. This picture here is of the Volvox colony, and each one of these individual little pieces in here is a cell of its own. Now these cells, if you see some form the outside of this little bubble, and it does, it looks like a little bubble, and there are other cells on the inside of this bubble, and you notice that the outer ring of cells seem very clear, very transparent, even though they make sort of a solid ball. And that's because in living in this colony, the single-celled organisms have somewhat specialized. The ones that are on the outside provide protection for the ones on the inside, and the ones on the inside tend to group together as well. So you've got to see a little group of them here, and they form these little green balls. Now whenever you see green cells, you know that they have chlorophyll, and from middle school science you know that chlorophyll is where photosynthesis takes place in plant cells. Well, it also takes place in plant-like protists, which is in fact what these are. So these little plant-like protists, the collection of cells on the inside, because they don't have to worry about defense and protection, actually start to specialize in energy production, making sugars and carbohydrates from the sun through photosynthesis. They then share that energy with the cells that are providing the protection around the edges. Now the cool thing about these unicellular colonies is that you can break up this colony, and each one of those organisms, each one of those cells can go on and live its own life, and in fact it will probably group up or start another colony. So these are really sort of a unique blend of unicellular and multicellular organisms. And I have a short little video clip here to show you the Volvox colony. It's actually pretty neat. So it's just a little 1-minute clip. There's not a lot of sound. So you can actually see the individual little shapes of the cells, though. This is pretty cool. And then on the inside, you can see the bubbles of more specialized cells, which is pretty cool. So, is it a multicellular organism or a single-celled organism? All right, we'll go back to our notes. All right. That was the first part of the cell theory. The second part of the cell theory is that cells are the basic unit of structure and function. What that means is that all living things, regardless of whether they're single-celled or multi-celled, is that this is the smallest structure and function. So these cells in a multicellular organism act as structure for tissues. Those tissues then form together to make organs. The organs come together in organ systems. Those organ systems then come together to enable the multicellular organism to survive. It's also the basic unit of function. While there are parts inside the cell called the organelles, if you remove any of those organelles from the cell, they no longer cease to perform their function. So the cellular level is the smallest you can go and still have some structure and function in a living thing. So cells all transform and use energy. Every single one of them, they need to do this. Well, I should say most of them. Some of them don't use or transform a great deal of energy, and in that case, those cells are short-lived. An example is the human blood cell. It does not transform energy. It doesn't need to. All it's supposed to do is travel around your bloodstream, collect oxygen, and drop it off as cells need it. So they wear out pretty quickly. They don't have a mechanism to repair themselves. So your body is constantly filtering your blood for old blood cells and creating new ones. All cells maintain homeostasis, so they have to create an internal condition that is relatively stable. And we'll talk more about this in the cell transport chapter, where we talk about how things cross the cell membrane and what sorts of problems and good things that can do for the cell. This is an interesting one. This is the third part of the cell theory. Cells only come from the reproduction of other cells. There are two basic types of cell reproduction. You can have sexual reproduction and you can have asexual reproduction. Now, we've given sexual reproduction in bacteria and in animal cells and plant cells different names than it has for one or the other. Sorry, that was confusing. Bacteria, we have a different name for sexual reproduction than we have for the sexual reproduction of animal and plant cells. So, in bacteria, sexual reproduction is called conjugation. And really, conjugation just means that the bacteria, if you can imagine two cars, they pull up beside each other, roll down the window, pass some DNA through the window, so they trade some DNA, and that's considered sexual reproduction because you actually have a new organism now that the DNA has changed. In animal cells and in plant cells, you go through meiosis, which is the creation of sperm and egg cells. Or in the case of some plants and plant-like protists, animal-like protists, you may have the production of spores, which may contain eggs or sperm. Asexual reproduction is very similar to you're cloning the cell that's already there. You're just making an exact copy. In bacteria, when they make an exact copy of themselves, we call it binary fission, and they simply just split down the middle. In plant cells and animal cells, when cells make copies of themselves through asexual reproduction, we call it mitosis. And we will study all of those a little later. I want to bring you back to the idea that cells only come from the reproduction of other cells, and how I said that this was a theory, and that I used to tell my classes that we know all of the parts and the pieces that make up cells, but if you put them all together, we can't make it quite function or come to life. And I want to throw an interesting idea out there. I read a short little paragraph in Nature magazine about a Japanese scientist who claims, I don't know if this is true or not, but claims to have made a sperm cell and an egg cell without the sperm or the egg cell coming from a pre-existing cell. And the reason why this made the news is not because it might upset the cell theory, but because if you could make an artificial sperm cell and an artificial egg cell, what kind of person would it be? It's an interesting thought. So it is a theory, and if at some point in time we can create a cell that does not come from the reproduction of an existing cell, then we'll have to modify the theory. So, not out of the realm of possibility. Thanks for watching. If you need to watch it again, please do.